Hello, my dear friends, and welcome back. It's wonderful to have you here, and I do hope your story tonight helps you rest and find peace. Just before we start, let yourself settle down into your favorite sleeping position. Adjust your pillows, pull your blankets up exactly as you like them, and let the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. I wanted to share a little thought with you about why I chose to write this particular story for us tonight. Lately, I've been thinking about the absolute beauty of slowness, about how rare it is to find a place that doesn't demand we rush. In our own lives, we're constantly watching the minutes, hurried along by bells and alarms, and the relentless pace of the world. I wanted to create a sanctuary where time behaves differently. A story where we discover that a life measured by seasons, lengthening shadows, and kindness is far richer than one measured by strict, unyielding seconds. So tonight, we're visiting a tale of pure patience, tailored just for you. Before we begin our walk down to the village lane, let us take a slow, comforting breath together. Breathing in that quiet evening air, holding it gently for a moment, and now letting it go with a soft, long sigh. Feel your eyelids growing just a little bit heavier. Let the muscles in your face soften, and let my voice guide you into the peaceful twilight. The autumn had deepened into a season of heavy burnt amber and orange-flecked marmalade, leaving the valley tucked beneath a sleepy, protective tide of moorland mist. It was thick and silent, and smelled of cold slate and wet bracken, softening the sharp edges of the thatched roofs, and curling around the roots of the sleeping willows. Down the centre of the cobbled village lane, Rosco and the bunnies moved with a rhythmic, easy pace. The gravel crunched softly underfoot, a dry, steady sound that seemed to measure out the stillness of the evening. Chimneys along the lane were clearing their throats, sending up thin blue ribbons of peat smoke that hung suspended in the heavy air like spun wool. When they reached the centre of the village square, they paused, looking up at the high, square tower of the old parish hall. Built of weathered white limestone that had grown patches of pale green lichen, the tower stood like a silent sentinel over the valley. High up sat the grand village clock, its iron hands, heavy and black, had been frozen at exactly 10 minutes to 4 for over 30 years. The village had long loved this silence, without the mechanical chime to bustle their chores along. The village folk lived by a more natural, comfortable rhythm. Nash the baker opened his doors when the morning mist cleared from the river. Shepherd Rumplewool brought his flock down from the hills when the shadows reached the roots of the old boundary oak. And the bunnies wended their way home whenever the wild marigolds began to fold their petals for the night. Time in the valley didn't tick. It flowed, gentle and unhurried, like a slow stream over smooth stones. That ancient silence changed on a crisp morning when a small, high-wheeled cart rolled into the square, drawn by a shaggy grey pony whose breath came in short white plumes. The driver was Horatio Pendulum of Blackberry Copse, an elderly hedgehog clocksmith whose silver-tipped quills were permanently dusted with a fine chalk powder. Horatio was a craftsman of the old school, a creature who viewed a silent clock as a broken promise to the world. He wore a stiff leather apron crackling with age, its pockets bulging with tiny bone oil vials, soft flannel cloths, and heavy brass keys. To Horatio, bringing order to the valley was the ultimate act of neighbourly devotion. He had volunteered his life's skill to restore the parish clock, genuinely believing that the gift of perfect, civilized time would bring a grand harmony to the village folk. Rosco and the bunnies, always eager to welcome a guest, offered to help the old craftsman carry his heavy oak tool chests up into the belfry. They climbed the spiral stone steps, their boots creating a slow, echoing rhythm against the cool, limestone walls, until they emerged into the vast, draughty heart of the tower. The ancient clockwork mechanism sat in the centre of the room like a sleeping iron giant. It was a magnificent machine, built from heavy forged stays and huge brass wheels that had grown dull and dark under decades of dust and sleepy cobwebs. Moving with an unhurried, meditative focus, Horatio began the ritual of awakening. There was no mechanical rushing here. The cleaning itself was a slow, hypnotic lullaby. Horatio had brought along a jar of thick, lavender-scented grease, and together with Rosco they began to soothe the ancient metal. The sounds in the belfry became a quiet symphony. There was the soft, rhythmic scritch, shuck of Millie Moonbeam's flannel cloth as she rubbed a toothy brass cog, turning its dull, dark surface into a warm, glowing gold that caught the morning light like a captured sun. There was the heavy, dull clink of iron spanners as Horatio tightened the frame bolts, and the rich herbal scent of the lavender oil filling the draughty spaces, drowning out the smell of old dust and dry timber. Berry and Caratina worked with small badger hair brushes, sweeping away the cobwebs from the heavy bronze bells hanging high in the rafters. Every motion was deliberate, measured, and calm. Horatio moved from wheel to wheel, applying a single drop of clear oil from a bone stylus to the center of each axle. As the old metals warmed beneath their hands, the machinery seemed to lose its stiff, cold resistance, settling into a state of heavy, polished readiness. Horatio smiled, his dark eyes bright behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, entirely convinced that his work would bring a beautiful, perfect structure to the peaceful valley below. With the final drop of oil placed upon the brass pivots, Horatio Pendulum reached out a hand and took hold of the great bronze pendulum. It hung from the vaulted timber ceiling like a heavy, polished plum, suspended by a long rod of forged iron. Moving with absolute certainty, the clocksmith gave the disc a firm heave-to, then a push. The silence of 30 years shattered with a deep metallic clank. For a moment the ancient gears seemed to hesitate, their heavy teeth catching and holding in the lavender grease. Then the mechanism settled into its work. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It reverberated through the limestone walls of the tower, pouring out of the open belfry windows and descending over the village lanes, as heavy as a woolen blanket left on the clothesline in the rain. It was a cold, iron heartbeat, a precise mechanical metronome that left nary a cozy corner for the sleepy, drifting silence of the autumn mist. The bunnies were the first to feel the shift as they wended their way back down the spiral stairs. Usually their paws moved with instinctive, quiet cooperation, guided only by the slow travel of the sun. But as they stepped out into the village square, the relentless clock followed them, measuring out the seconds with a sharp, heavy insistence. Within 3 days, the comfortable harmony of the valley began to fray at the edges. The lanes lost their slow, meditative grace. Nash the baker, usually a portrait of broad-shouldered patience, found himself looking up at the high, white clock face every few minutes. The rhythmic thump, slap of his bread dough became faster, driven by a growing worry that he had to have his loaves out of the brick ovens before the great bronze bell struck the noon cadence. Down by the river, the weavers threw their wooden shuttles with a hurried, tense energy, trying to match the mechanical rhythm that now filled their quiet workshops. Even old Shepherd Rumplewool felt the insistence. He no longer waited for the shadows to reach the roots of the boundary oak, but hurried his long-fleeced sheep down the rocky path to beat the 4 o'clock chime. The village folk walked with shorter, quicker strides, their heads dipping, their shoulders hunched. A strange, uncosy restlessness had settled over the entire community, as if the valley had been wound up too tight by a giant brass key. That evening, the cottage kitchen was wrapped in what should have been a haven of deep comfort. A large blue stoneware pot of root broth was simmering slowly on the cast-iron stove, sending up lazy, fragrant clouds of sage and celery root. Rosco sat at the scrubbed pine table, a heavy wooden-handled knife in his palm, slicing winter squash into thick, uniform wedges against the sycamore chopping block. But the beautiful silence of the evening was missing. Even through the thick insulating thatch of the roof and the heavy timber doors, the distant sharp ticking of the parish clock penetrated the room, steady and inescapable. Millie Moonbeam sat on a low, three-legged stool, her long velvety ears drooping low over her shoulders. She held her mending basket in her lap, but her needle remained still. Beside her, Berry and Caratina lay on a rag rug by the hearth, their eyelids trembling, too restless to sink into their usual pre-bed drowse. The soup simmered in the stoneware glaze with its slow liquid bubble and pop, but it was entirely drowned out by the metallic tick-tock from the tower. Rosco laid his knife down on the wooden table. He looked at the bunnies, his face softening with a heavy, sympathetic concern. Their limbs were not leaden with the satisfying exhaustion of a peaceful day. They were tight, held fast by the invisible strings of the clocksmith's perfect time. Meanwhile, at the edge of the square, Horatio Pendulum sat on a stone bench beneath the copper wall lanterns. He had his wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his whiskerful nose, his paws resting on his tumblington, and a leather ledger in his lap, ready to record the village's praise for his mechanical triumph. But as he watched the dark lane, no one came to thank him. Instead, he observed Mr. Bramblewick hurry past without a word, his face drawn as he nervously checked an old pewter pocket watch against the tower hands. He saw the field mice scurrying into their nests with a frantic, uncharacteristic haste. Finally he looked through the low window of Roscoe's cottage and saw the bunnies sitting in total troubled stillness, their ears hanging like day-old parsley. The elaborate scaffolding of Horatio's pride fractured completely. The grand, civilized gift he thought he had bestowed was not a blessing at all. His absolute precision had not brought harmony. It had brought a burden. He had given them perfect accuracy, but in doing so he had stolen the timeless, gentle space where their hearts felt safe. The heavy brass keys in his apron pocket suddenly felt like cold iron weights, and oh, what a crisis of conscience swept over the old hedgehog as the clock above gave another loud, solitary tock. The deep middle of the night arrived in a shroud of thick, silver-grey lavender fog that drifted down from the high dales and wrapped the village square in a profound, protective silence. The only sound left in the world was from the cold, sharp clock echoing from the limestone belfry, cutting through the billowy mist like a bread knife. Inside the cottage kitchen, a small oil lamp burned on the dresser, its wick blossoming into a low, honey-coloured glow that cast long, lazy shadows across the exposed pine floorboards. Rosco and the bunnies sat around the hearth, their spirits heavy, when a soft, hesitant scratch sounded at the thick timber door. Rosco pushed the door open to find Horatio Pendulum standing on the threshold, his silver-tipped quills flattened against his back, his heavy leather apron damp with the night dew. His wire-rimmed spectacles were misted over, and his dark eyes were filled with a quiet, sorrowful humility. In his front paws he cradled a small, battered tin box. "I have broken the peace of the valley," the old clocksmith said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "I sought to bring you perfection, but I have only brought you haste." Rosco didn't offer a single word of blame. Instead, he pulled out a heavy, high-backed ash chair, welcoming the old hedgehog into the warmth of the room. Caratina moved with an unhurried grace to the cast-iron stove, where she took up a long birchwood ladle and stirred a fresh stoneware pot of chamomile and dried elderberry tea. She ladled the dark, sweet brew into heavy earthenware mugs, passing them hand to hand without a sound. They sat together at the pine table, letting the rich herbal steam rise up to warm their noses. Horatio sat quietly, letting his small paws absorb the radiant heat of his mug. As the chamomile began to work its way through their chests, down to their tumblingtons, smoothing out the tight anxiety of the past few days, Horatio opened his small tin box. Inside, resting upon a scrap of faded flannel, lay a single square remnant of thick, deep-pile midnight blue velvet, the very fabric left behind by the weaver of the high ferns. It was an impossible textile, softer than a swan's wing, designed to absorb sound and weight into its plush, downy nap. Time should be a comfort, not a master, Horatio said, tracing the tightly woven edge of the cloth. If you will help me climb the tower once more, We can give the valley a heartbeat it can rest by. Moving with absolute quiet, the small company slipped back out into the misty lane. They climbed the spiral stone steps to the parish tower by the faint glow of Rosco's lantern, their boots making a slow, rhythmic cadence against the limestone. When they reached the draughty belfry, the great iron gears were still turning with cold, heartless precision. Horatio took up his brass keys and a pair of delicate bone tweezers. Moving with the patience of an old clocksmith, he didn't change the weights or alter the heavy pendulum. Instead, he took the small square of midnight velvet and gently slid it beneath the iron teeth of the escape wheel, fashioning a soft, cushioned shim right where the metal met the stone anchor. With a tiny brass screwdriver, he deliberately unbalanced another cog, widening the space between the teeth by a fraction of an inch, allowing the great machine to breathe. The transformation was instantaneous. The sharp, metallic clank dissolved. The heavy bronze pendulum continued to swing, but its voice had changed completely. It now moved with a lazy, luxurious, cushioned sigh. The sound was no longer a demand. It was a lullaby. It was a deep, woolly whisper that seemed to absorb the room's small noises, expanding the space between the seconds until the minutes felt as wide and safe as a summer meadow. Horatio let out a long cloud of pale breath into the chilly air, his shoulders dropping in total relief as the new sleepy heartbeat of the tower poured down over the rooftops. When the morning broke through the lavender mist, the valley awoke to a world that felt entirely restored to its old, unhurried grace. The parish clock still kept its vigil, but it did so with a beautiful, generous looseness. Nash the baker stood by his brick ovens, a deep smile returning to his broad face as he listened to the slow, sleepy pulse from the tower. He no longer rushed his hands. He let the dough rise until it was plump and perfect, knowing the clock would wait for the bread. Down by the river, the weavers moved their wooden shuttles with a meditative, flowing rhythm, and old Shepherd Rumplewool sat on a granite boulder, letting his long fleece sheep graze until the late afternoon shadows naturally guided them home. The valley had found its true anchor. Not a clock that counted what was lost, but one that celebrated the slow beauty of the present. By the time the evening twilight ebbed away into shades of ripe elderberry and slate, Rosco and the bunnies wended their way back up the lane toward their cottage. The air was utterly still, held fast in the mist's cool embrace. When Rosco pushed open the thick timber door, the damp air stayed on the threshold, replaced instantly by the deep, baking warmth of the kitchen stove. The rooms were silent, illuminated only by the sleepy crimson eye of the turf embers casting long, soft shadows across the pine floorboards. Before the stairs could be climbed, they attended to the final small ritual of the night. The long walk had left them a little bit hollow, and their tumblingtons required that small warm nourishment that ensures an unbroken sleep. Rosco touched a splinter to the oil lamp on the dresser, its wick blossoming into a low, honey-coloured glow that turned the hanging copper pans into shining moons. Berry reached into the willow bin and fetched a grey-skinned winter squash and 3 small, shriveled orchard apples, setting them on the thick sycamore chopping block. Rosco took his heavy wooden-handled knife. With care and patience, he split the squash, the blade meeting the wood with a soft, hollow thwack. The split halves revealed a deep, gold-orange flesh that smelled of the summer earth. He turned to the apples, the knife cutting through the skins with a crisp, clean crunch, releasing a sharp, nostalgic sweetness into the warm kitchen. By the cast-iron range, Caratina took up a long birchwood ladle. In the blue stoneware pot, a rich broth of roots and winter herbs had been steeping since noon. With a heavy arm, she began to move the ladle in slow, clockwise circles. She dropped in a few fragrant sage leaves and a few grains of rock salt, the steam rising in a cloud that smelled of roasted parsnips and celery root. Millie Moonbeam fetched 4 shallow bowls from the dresser, her small paws ensuring the ceramic didn't clatter, placing each down on the scrubbed pine table with a gentle clink. Beside them she laid 4 heavy pewter spoons, dull and cool to the touch. Berry brought out a loaf of sourdough bread from Nash's bakery, and Rosco ladled the food with a slow, generous hand. A pool of the golden broth, a soft wedge of the steamed squash, and the sweet, collapsed ribbons of the apple. They sat at the old table, the chairs giving a short, lazy scrape against the floor. Not a word was spoken. They preserved the great silence of the night. They ate with lazy thoughts of the summer just gone as they savoured the fruits of their labour in their garden, letting each warm, delumptious spoonful soothe their throats and spread a radiant, heavy heat from their tumblingtons down to their toe beans. With every slow swallow, the last tension of the long walk dissolved. Their limbs grew leaden, their shoulders dropped, and an inescapable drowsiness wrapped around them like a heavy wool blanket. When the bowls were cleared, Rosco wiped the table with a soft flannel cloth, and the bunnies let out one final deep communal sigh. Their bodies were filled, their chests were warm, and the night was waiting. One by one, the bunnies wended their way upstairs, where the great feather beds stood high and white in the gloom. The deep, down-filled mattresses looked impossibly soft, plumped up like summer clouds. Millie Moonbeam slipped between the linen sheets, her small frame sinking instantly into the deep down until the bed rose up around her, shaping itself to her body. She pulled the heavy patchwork quilt, now bearing its fresh indigo square of velvet, right to her chinnigan. Beside her, Berry and Caratina burrowed into their own beds, shifting twice before settling into the deep, pillowy silence. Rosco climbed into his own bed, letting his body find the absolute center of the mattress. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint, dry rustle of the straw below and the slow, reassuring breathing of the bunnies around him. From high in the village square, the soft, muted chime of the parish clock drifted over the thatch, a gentle, distant whisper that sounded like a blessing upon the sleeping valley. The clock was slow. The coats were warm and the cottage was perfectly cozy. As you let your own eyes close fully now, and you sink into the absolute support of your bed, let these gentle thoughts wrap around you like a blanket of soft velvet. I am safe and I am warm. My hands are at rest and my day is complete. I can let go of the world now. Everything is taken care of. My mind is clearing, becoming as quiet as the midnight sky. I am surrounded by comfort, inside and out. I give myself permission to fully drift away. I am protected. I am at peace. I am ready for sleep. Let the slow, steady rhythm of your breathing carry you deeper and deeper into the quiet dark. The mending is done. The village is asleep. And you are completely safe. All was snug. All was well. Night, night.